us right now. It is with great delight that I have the honor to introduce our conference keynote lecture titled Cultural Change from the Greatest to Raquel Fernández. Raquel received her PhD in economics from Columbia University. She's a professor of economics at NYU. She's also a member of the Center for Study of Equality, Social Organization and Performance at the University of Oslo, the Economic and Policy Research, the Institute of Labor Economics, and a member of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Working Group. She has previously been a tenured professor at the London School of Economics and Boston University, and she held visiting positions at various institutions such as the University of Chicago, the Paris School of Economics, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve Board, the IMF, among others. Professor Fernandez is also the president of the Latin American and the Caribbean Economic Association, LACEA, where under her leadership, the Women Economists in Latin America and the Caribbean, WILAC, the committee was created. She has also served as director of the Public Policy Program of CEPR, has been a panel member of the National Science Foundation, and program committee member of the Social Science Research Council. Professor Fernandez's innovative work is related to culture and economics, marital sorting, education policy, and the transmission of inequality across generations. She has published extensively in the leading scientific journals. She has been a member of the editorial board of the Review of Economic Dynamics, the Journal of International Economics and Economic Policy, Economia, among others, besides receiving numerous awards. So, dear Raquel, it is an honor to have you here, and for sure we cannot wait to hear your presentation. So thank you once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. It's really a pleasure to be here. I just came out of a fabulous meeting of the Bolivian Women in Economics, I think it's network, I'm not sure, but it was great. I really enjoyed it with Paulina Estrepo and with Fabiola and other people, and it was a great experience. So I'm very happy to be here to present my work. So let me start by sharing my screen with you, which hopefully you're now seeing. Yes, you are. And I'm going to be talking about cultural change, and in particular, asking questions related to, a little bit at least, to why have gender roles changed. Okay. So let me just start here. So women, in some sense, have come a long way. Gender inequality is both historically and geographically ubiquitous. Men throughout societies and throughout history have enjoyed greater freedoms and greater opportunities than women, even of the same social characteristics as them. They possessed more power within the family. They held the preponderance of social positions that mattered most, with politically, economically, and culturally. And over the last 150 years, however, we have seen important changes. I'm just going to speak about a few of them. Married women obtained the right to property. They obtained the right to vote. And employment discrimination is mostly illegal in most countries. But still, as we're all aware, there's large gender gaps, both in entrepreneurship, taking positions of CEOs, political power, their representation in STEM fields, which is, for those of you who are not aware, it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, wages, the amount of time that they spend taking care of children or working in the house. There's still important gender gaps in that area. So I'm just going to spend not more than hopefully 3 minutes reminding you of some facts. These are just snapshots. I just tried to take the latest figure without going to the pandemic because that mixes things up. So this is simply the share of women in the labor force in 2019. Bolivia, hopefully you can see my little mouse, is pretty much actually has a fairly large labor share. I was kind of surprised, 44%. All these are Latin American countries, but I've put also for comparison the EU average and then the US on the left. If you look at the intensive margin, how many hours women work, then if you look again through different Latin American countries, the percentage of women, which are the ones in orange, relative to men, the ones in blue, who are working 60 hours or more weekly in their main occupation. You see that that's dominated by the blues in almost every country, not completely. Honduras is a little bit of an outlier there. And in Latin America, on the other end, the percentage of individuals who work 30 or fewer hours in their main occupation, now you see that, you know, the oranges are often 30% or more of that labor force, of the female labor force, is working 30 hours or less in their main occupation. If you do a Mincer style regression and you ask what part of you know, women's wages is not explained by demographic or employment sector variables, then you find that this is positive, both for employees and for own account workers, empleadores, self-employed workers, that's what I mean to say here, cuenta propia in Spanish. And you can see these are expressed here as fractions, as percentages, sorry, of women's average labor income. And you can see they can be really pretty high in most countries in Latin America. When it comes to studying, basically in every country in Latin America, and I'm only giving you a few countries here, but basically in every country, women are the majority of the individuals who go on to have tertiary education and graduate. So you see, again, that's the orange here. This is over 50% in all of these countries that we have graphed over here. But if you look at the representation in STEM fields, which is this reddish color, ICT, which is information and communications technology, or engineering, manufacturing, and construction, then women no longer make up more than 50%. Instead, their representation can be as low as 10 or 15%, ranging all the way up to, say, 40%. What about politics? Here is for 2020, what the proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments. In Bolivia, here, as you can see, is kind of an, again, it's really quite high. 46.2% of seats are held by women, you know, as opposed to, say, you know, I don't know which other country you'd like to take, but Brazil, say, about closer to 15%. In the United States, again, just by way of comparison, that number is about a quarter, it's 27%. Let's look at a different issue, that of intimate partner violence. And I'm afraid here, Bolivia is an unfortunate outlier. What this shows you is Latin American countries here are the ones which have color, as opposed to the grayish blue ones. For the Latin American countries, what you're going to see is that the percent of women who say that they've experienced physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner at some point in their life is extremely high in Bolivia. It's over 60%. No country comes even other close to it. And then if you were to ask the question, you know, are there circumstances in which a husband or partner is justified in beating his wife or partner, then Bolivia, again, I think is, oh, do we have Bolivia here? Yeah, Bolivia here is fairly high, it's at 16%. It's worse in some other countries, such as Peru, but still it's not as low as it could be, say, as in Uruguay, with, you know, 1.5%. So there is some belief that, you know, it's okay to beat your wife under some circumstances. So now I've given you that snapshot. I'm not going to be explaining any of those snapshots that I showed you. I felt some responsibility to show you where the gender gaps are these days. The questions that I want to ask is actually historical in some sense, which is to ask, why has gender inequality changed dramatically? And a related question, which is, why have attitudes towards same-sex relationships changed so quickly? So this is something that we've all lived in our lifetime. I actually don't know the situation in Bolivia, but it's something that, you know, in the United States, you certainly have lived through in Argentina and Uruguay in Europe, et cetera, you've seen dramatic changes in attitudes towards same-sex relationships. And that's actually what we're spending a lot of the time talking about. But first, let me tell you a little bit about what we know. So why does culture change? First of all, I'm not going to give you much of a definition for culture. That's a lot of work now in economics that talks about culture and how it matters to different economic outcomes. But I'm happy for you to take it as the intergenerational adaptive transmission of beliefs or knowledge. And as economists, if you're asked why does something change, you always try to find some sort of shock. Okay, so you could think that it changes in response to shocks that change incentives. That change incentives to what people do, and therefore they end up changing beliefs. So what kind of things could those be? Technology, institutions, environmental, or just new knowledge or new information that can come in various forms. One important thing that makes culture different than, I don't know, beliefs about, which food is better, do you prefer vanilla or chocolate ice cream, is that these are social beliefs. So as an economy changes, one way that a society keeps a culture is to monitor or to punish people who transgress against that culture. So for example, as a country becomes more urban, it may be less possible to monitor and punish transgressors, which is why you often find that urban centers, there's much more heterogeneity in beliefs. In general, we believe that there's going to be a rather complex interplay between any changes that occur, whether they're in technology, institutions, and in culture, that are going to end up changing what people's beliefs are over time. So what I wanted to do, given that this is a keynote, is not just talk about my work, but to give you an idea about what the work that has been done in this area. Now, a lot of the work doesn't necessarily see itself as talking about cultural change, yet what it's saying is relevant to cultural change. So please take what I'm going to say next in that spirit. So there's very little work that asks how and why culture changes. One area in which this has come up is places that have had imbalanced sex ratio, where the ratio of men to women is varying either much higher than the norm or much lower than the norm. And furthermore, there's variation across places or across time in that ratio. What authors like Grosjean and Qatar have done in the context of variation of sex ratios across Australia, historically given because of the way that convicts ended up kind of accidentally going to different provinces within Australia. These convicts were mostly men, so you ended up with very imbalanced sex ratios for a long period of time, but they also varied across different provinces. Gay does this in the, looks at imbalanced sex ratios that occur because of World War I, which kills off a significant proportion of men. It does so differentially across different French departments, different provinces, say, in France. And he exploits that differentiation to look at how that influences attitudes towards work and women's working. And Tissot, in the context of African slavery, which tended to want to have more male slaves than female slaves because the men were seen as more valuable, this also led to variation that happened again for significant periods of time across different parts of Africa. This imbalance in the sex ratio has been shown to lead to either greater or less female labor force participation, depending which way that sex ratio went, and to changes in attitudes today. Many, often hundreds of years after this happened, with World War I, just 100 years after this happened, that persists today. So you can see it in terms of, how conservative beliefs are with respect to women's role in the home or outside of the home. Now, culture can also change in response to incentives. Natalie Ball has a nice paper where she looks at a new policy that comes in, which is a pension policy. So there used to not exist pensions, and then pensions are introduced both in Indonesia and in Ghana. Indonesia, a lot of ethnic groups were matrilocal, meaning that after marriage, the couple went and lived in the house, or at least a village, but usually in the house of the parents of the girl. Vis-a-vis Ghana, which was patrilocal, which meant that they went and they lived, once they married, in the house of the parents of the boy. And what she shows is that when pensions are introduced, then girls become, in matrilocal societies, less important. Because before they were bringing themselves and the husbands to help with work and help with income at home. And now they're no longer doing that. Now that longer is not so, sorry, it's not that they're no longer doing that. That's no longer so needed because now you have pensions giving you money for when you're old. So reduce the values of daughters and you see education falls in these matrilocal ethnic groups in Indonesia, as well as does a probability that a girl actually resides with her parents after marriage. So we have cultural change in response to policy changes. In a paper I did a long time ago with Alessandra Fogli and Claudio Olivetti, which we weren't necessarily thinking about culture either again, we were looking at, for various reasons, we isolated the idiosyncratic component across in the variation that exists across US states in men's mobilization rates during World War II. So kind of a bit related to what Gay did it, but we did do it in 2004, just to be clear. So variation across this mobilization rates. In states with higher mobilization rates, more women worked. This was very much a campaign that the government carried out. So many men were away that there was not enough workers. Women were not working at that point. So they had this image, and that's the title of Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter, she's shown with a wrench in her hand and her muscles showing, and she's wearing kind of these overalls, and she is going to go and work, okay? It's not surprising that where more men went to work, more women worked. We would expect that. But what we find, and the part that would have a cultural aspect to it, is that this effect carries over to the next generation. And precisely, to be precise, what we find is that when you look at 8 to 12-year-olds, people who would have been 8 to 12-year-olds when their mothers were out working because the men were at war, then those are precisely the groups that you find in those states working more, the ones who are 8 to 12 years old during that period. Now, what does this tell you? Well, it's consistent with learning. It could be that preferences and attitudes are transmitted from these mothers who are working to their daughters and to their sons. It could be that simply, women look at what other women did before them and they learn from the experience of the previous generation, even if nothing is directly transmitted in the home. Furthermore, there's the employer part. Employers who basically did not employ many women before learned the value of women as workers. So all of those things could lead to cultural change. In the area of politics, one can see the paper of Beeman and her co-authors as suggesting that cultural change can happen because you have different examples given to you. So let me be concrete. In '98 in West Bengal, a random 1/3 of village council leader positions were reserved for women. So 1/3 were chosen randomly. What Beeman and co-authors show is that as a result of this experience, men were less likely to associate women with domestic roles and more with leadership roles. That's good. But much more important was that 10 years after these quotas were put in place, if the village seat had been reserved for the prior 2 elections, and now it was no longer reserved, it was much more likely that a woman would want to run for office, and furthermore, that she would win. So that's showing you that there's cultural change, both on the part of the voters and part of women in terms of their willingness to step up for an election. Perhaps an easier way to learn is via watching TV. So again, this is a paper by La Ferrara, Chong, and Durea in the context of Brazil. and Jensen and Oster in the context of India, what they show is they use variation in the entry of Brazilian soap operas, las telenovelas, in Brazil. And what they show is those places that were more exposed or were exposed first to soap operas, those places end up seeing a fall in fertility. Why would this be a cultural thing? Well, those Brazilian soap operas were showing families that were much smaller than the average family that would have existed in these areas in Brazil. So they were portraying families that were of lower fertility. Very similar thing happened when cable TV was introduced in rural parts of India. Again, these are showing smaller families, and they're also showing more modern families. Fertility fell there, and women in those areas were less likely to express a preference for boys, which was fairly wide, I would say, in India at that point. And furthermore, female autonomy, the ability to go outside, agency, to exert an opinion, etc., that also increased. Lastly, one can learn from socially, and also one can learn simply that one has mistaken beliefs about what other people think. So there's a very cute experiment that Burstein, Gonzalez, and Yanagisawa did in the context of Saudi Arabia, where they brought in, several married men from the same neighborhood who may or may not know each other. And they asked them independently, so they were to write down both whether they thought it was okay for their wife to work and what they thought on average that the other men in the room would think about whether their own wives should work. And basically uniformly, men tended to say that it was okay, or much more okay, for their own wives to work. But they thought that the proportion of men who would say that it's not okay for wives to work was much higher than what it was in reality in those rooms. So they could just compare what those numbers were. And what they did was to tell some men what that mean was, what that average was, whereas others they did not tell. And then they offered both groups of men, either an app or access to an app that would make it easier for a wife to get a job-seeking service or be paired up with a job-seeking service, and maybe simply some credit for, say, towards using a mobile phone. And what they found is that those men that were told, actually, it's much lower than what you think. It's X percent of men thinks it's not okay for women to work. Many, many more men than what you think are actually fine with women working. Those are the men who chose for the app, or a greater proportion of those men chose for the app, whereas in the untreated group, the group that did not learn the truth about what the true percentage of men who did not disapprove or who approved of a wife working, those were much more likely to choose the phone credit. Lastly, I have a paper where I look at 120 years of married women's labor force participation in the context of the United States, which kind of looks like this. And I argue that that shape makes one think that something that looks like technological diffusion might be taking place with respect to beliefs about how good it is for women to work. So in particular, what I do is I write down a model where there's some common costs to women working, which is uncertain. It could be high, say, or it could be low. And women don't know how much it is, and it affects all of them. You could think about it, how bad is, today, if we were having this conversation today, we would say, how bad is it for your children for you to work? That you're not there to help them out. If you were having this conversation maybe 60 years ago, it would have been, how bad is it for your marriage? People used to believe that it would destabilize marriages for women to be out there interacting with other men. And then, even before that, it was considered maybe it was bad for women's psyche to be working. In any case, the actual object of preoccupation has changed over time, but it's always been an object of preoccupation. So suppose women have uncertainty about how bad it is to work. It could be very bad or not too bad. They have heterogeneous priors, but these are informative priors. They're centered around the truth. And they observe a noisy signal of the measure of the proportion of women from last generation who stayed home. And when they observe that, they update their priors. In addition to having, some common cost of working or not working, they also have idiosyncratic individual costs of which have some distribution in the population. In this model, the percentage of women who work and the distribution of beliefs evolve endogenously over time, depending on how male and female wages make it more or less attractive for married women to work, and depending on women's beliefs. But women observe a noisy signal of how much women used to work, and then from that, they can try to deduce something about how bad is it for women to work. So what I do is to calibrate this model to US statistics from modern times. Then I feed in the male wage series for 120 years and the female wage series for 120 years. And I try to evaluate the performance of this learning model to generate the path that we see for married women's labor force participation over 120 years. And what I do is I try to figure out whether these changing beliefs played a quantitative important role, or is it just really wages that changed that were the main things? Of course, wages are also endogenous, but I'm not taking that into account. I just feed them in. And the model has some interesting implications. Here you can see is the true data. Those are the round circles. Women used to work, 3% of married. These are all white women because Black women have a different trajectory because of slavery. These are all white women. As you can see, basically no women worked. 3% of white married women used to work. And you see it only slowly takes off. And then it accelerates, especially between 1970, 80, and 90. Very large changes. And what I do is I decompose this into a part that's due to beliefs, independently of wages changing, a part that is due to simply the static effect, what I call a static effect of wages. And that static effect of wages is that if wages are higher, ceteris paribus, you're more likely to want to work. And lastly, and the more interesting part, which I don't have that much time to go into right now, is that this model has a dynamic implication for wages. And in particular, when very few women are working, it's very hard to learn anything because the signal is so noisy. And once you get to many more women working, it's much easier to understand if the true cost of working is high or low. And what this means is that there is a role for policy in speeding up learning by incentivizing women to work in those periods when women is slow. Now, this holds for a policymaker that has exactly the same beliefs as the population. It's not because a policymaker knows the true cost. The policymaker has the same beliefs as a median woman. But there is an externality in this model, which is not being taken into account, which is what one generation does not only affects that generation, but it affects the speed at which the next generation is going to learn. And that's a part that can be positively affected by policy. And then I show, these are the beliefs. This is I've always shown this slide, I might as well do it this time. This is a percentage of people who approved of a wife working if her husband could support her. This is a question that we're really lucky was asked from 1936. It was first asked in the US. This, it shows you that less than 20% of the population approved of a woman working if her husband could support her. And as you can see, unfortunately, there's no data here. This really changed over time to the point that it's no longer asked because basically everybody agrees that it's fine for a woman to work. Although I was wondering who that remaining 20% is that is kind of holding out. But in any case, what we show, and I'm not going to show it to you now, is that the model is capable of generating beliefs, the medium beliefs that look like this. And these are medium beliefs. There is dispersion in the population, just like there is dispersion in reality. So now let me turn to the main theme that I'd like to talk about. This was all older work, published work that I was discussing previously. Now I'd like to talk to you about cultural change and same-sex relationships. So let me start with this graph. This shows you the percent of individuals in the US, these are representative polls from the General Social Survey that are asked from 1973 until now, that ask, is it wrong for same-sex adults to have sexual relations? And what I'm graphing here is not the percentage who think it's wrong, but rather the percent that answers that it's never wrong or that it's only sometimes wrong, as opposed to answering it's always wrong or it's almost always wrong. So I'm going to call that percent that answers never wrong or only sometimes wrong. I'm going to say they approve of same-sex relationships, and that's, I just call that same-sex app. That's what I'm graphing over here. And as you can see from this graph, for over, 20 years, from 1973 all the way till this dotted line, which we'll talk about, that's 1992, there's basically no change in the population. It's about 20% of people who approve, okay? All the rest are disapproving. So what we see clearly from the graph and what we know from our own lives is that these attitudes change. And the question is why? One popular hypothesis is that, people, there's just there's a kind of a movement towards more liberal thoughts. We see this in women working, we see this in civil rights for indigenous groups or for racial groups. We see this towards many, many things. And this is part of it. We're not going to argue with the explanation, but that's not the explanation we're going to give. Instead, what we argue is that this discontinuity that you see here, between here and here, where it jumps by some 10 percentage points, so 50% over where it was before, that is a clue as to what was happening during this period. And what happened between 1991 and 1993, I'm sure you can tell me tons of things happened, but one of the important things that happened was the 1992 presidential election. And that election was special because for the first time, both the Democratic and Republican Party mentioned gay people explicitly, and they took opposing stands, explicitly opposing stands on a particular question, which was whether gay people should be allowed to serve openly in the military. This is a position that all the Democratic candidates took the position. The Democratic candidate ended up being Bill Clinton. The Republican candidate was then President George H.W. Bush, so Bush Sr. Clinton, as you know, won that election. And then the entire next year, 1993, there is a debate in Congress over this question. And they end up having what's called a compromise solution. You can disagree whether it's a compromise or not, of don't ask, don't tell. That is, no, gay people cannot serve openly in the military, but we're not going to ask people whether they're gay, and they shouldn't tell us furthermore. So both parts have some responsibility. Because of that, this period saw unprecedented attention given by TV news channels to gay-related issues. So what you see in front of you right now is, on the left-hand axis, I'm measuring the number of news stories that are related to gay issues. So that means I look for particular keywords. On the right-hand side, I'm looking at something that's very important as well during this period, which is AIDS. I'm looking at the number of stories that is related to AIDS. The AIDS is in yellow. The purplish line is gay-related stories. And I guess I should clarify right now that when I say gay, I don't mean male. I'm just using it blanket-wise for men and women. So for those of you who don't remember their history, and there's no reason that you should necessarily, AIDS comes into the picture in the United States in the summer of 1981, okay? And so, there's various reasons that this becomes more or less important over time. When it comes to gay-related news stories, and we're looking at news stories in TV, and for those of you, I can't see you, so I don't know how young you are, but I'm going to assume you're pretty young. So you may not know that people really just got their news from watching TV. That's how you would sit down in the evening in the US and you would watch a noticiero, okay? Half-hour news program, and they would tell you what the news was. and there's no Twitter, and there's nothing else, okay, that you would be getting your news from. I mean, you could watch it on the radio, obviously, and you could read the newspaper, but that was a very important source of news. So these are the three main television channels, and this is the evening news 5 days a week. And as you can see, you know, the election year is fairly high, but the following year, 1993, there's tremendous attention given to gay-related concerns. Obviously, there's an overlap between gay-related stories and AIDS-related stories. But the dotted line is showing the number of stories that are overlapping. And as you can see, this giant increase is not due to an increase in the overlap of stories at all. Okay. So there's tremendous attention given to this. Newspapers, we look at 59 newspapers, through the same papers throughout. We start later, otherwise we basically don't have many papers to go on. And these are from 86 to 2002. These are, again, the number of gay-related stories. It's not 0.2, you have to multiply, you should be dividing that by 100 to get the share of newspaper stories across these 59 newspapers. What's the share of stories in each for each year? So that's what we're graphing here. And as you can see, 1993, again, is clearly an outlier. Why does this matter? Well, our hypothesis is that the public debate that came because of the election, and that came because of, because of the debate in Congress throughout all of 1993, made gay-related issues much more salient to the public. It also kind of legitimized these issues because they're not being talked about in some bar somewhere. They're being talked about by the main media. They're being talked about by presidential candidates. We think that the greater salience of public debate about these issues led people to reconsider their positions, and that initiated a process of cultural change that continues to today. Now, we can't prove that per se. We can just show you there's a big change in opinion. But what we can do is to argue that one would expect the impact of these national events to be larger in places with greater exposure to the gay community. Why would that be? Well, two different theories could be responsible for that. One would be contact theory, which says, okay, once you know you're interacting more with gay individuals, you're more sympathetic to them. You're less likely to discriminate against them. You're less likely to think that what they're doing is fundamentally immoral. Because remember, the question is about morality. It's not, should they have civil rights? It's about, is it wrong? It's a moral issue. Furthermore, that's one possibility. The other is that in those places where there's more exposure to the gay community, one would expect these national events to be more salient. First of all, again, there's more people around, so maybe you're going to pay more attention, but also there's local things that are happening, local demonstrations, local media that's picking up on these issues. So we expect it to be more present there. Let me say that from the outset, this debate was not seen as a debate about specific issues, like it says in that quote there, but it really is seen about what is the place of gay people in American society. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of evidence, and then I'm going to rush because I'm seeing I'm quickly running out of time. This is just some evidence. This is all we have. We're really lucky to even have this evidence, which is people were asked, do you have a friend or acquaintance who is gay or lesbian? And there's a few polls from the 80s that let us see that only 20 to 30% of Americans were willing to answer, were answering that they had some friend or acquaintance. Unfortunately, there's a big gap in between, but by the time that 1994 comes around, you know, closer to 50%, and then in this later on, it's 60%, think that they know someone who have a friend or an acquaintance who is gay. And if you do this rigorously and you control for, is it education, is it race, is it age, is it gender? It's none of that. It really is 25 percentage points increase that occurs in the what we would call the post period, that is 94 onwards. So let's go back to this graph. I've now cut the graph in 2002. Why do I cut it in 2002? Because in 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Court rules in favor of gay marriage, and that changes the whole debate and becomes a debate about gay marriage, and that increases approval again. So I don't want to get those two things mixed up. I'm going to be talking about this change here and then the subsequent increase. So the first thing I want to tell you is that your eyes do not deceive you. There is a discontinuity here. We can identify that rigorously by testing for it. And that discontinuity exactly happens in that pole year that doesn't exist here in 1992. So there is a time trend. Your eyes are not lying. You might think, well, maybe everything is changing. So what we do is we look at other social attitudes towards things that are controversial. So premarital sex, laws that govern pornography, abortion, should a woman belong in the home, extramarital sex, and here is ours, the red one is same-sex act. And we can test rigorously whether there's any change that occurs in these during this time period or around this time period. There is evolution of these things, it's not always flat, but there is no discontinuity in these attitudes. Same conclusion goes if we were instead to take capital punishment. You know, do you approve of Black president, interracial marriage, gun laws, female president? By the way, what I'm graphing is always a more liberal response to these questions, okay? Again, there is no discontinuity that occurs during this time period for those attitudes either. So what the paper shows, and I should say this is a paper that's joint with Sahar Parsa and Martina Villarengo, it's coming out in America, 30 Years of Cultural Change. What we show in this paper is that states and counties with greater exposure to the gay community had a larger positive change in opinion in the 90s relative to where they were in the 70s, relative to states or counties with low exposure. So what I'm going to concentrate on today is to show you the state level results. So the first thing I need to tell you is how do we measure exposure to the gay community? People don't go around volunteering their sexual identity in this time period necessarily. So what we do is we construct two state level measures of exposure to the gay population. One is the cumulative AIDS rate by the end of 1992. So how many AIDS cases there have been? AIDS at this period is primarily a male disease, and it's 89% of the cases are male. And it's primarily a disease that you get via sex, a smaller percentage via drugs, and even most of those drugs, needle sharing, most of that needle sharing is also with sexual encounters between men. So that's one measure. The other measure is from the 1990 census. The 1990 census was the first to introduce the category of an unmarried partner. And what it does is that it asks the person who's filling out that survey, first of all, their own sex, I've answered that before, but then they ask, are you living with somebody who you're not married to? And what sex is that person? So now you have the ability to put, two and two together and understand whether you're looking at same-sex partners. Now, both of these are obviously correlated measures. That's good, actually. The rank correlation of these two measures is 0.7. But they capture somewhat different things. The cumulative AIDS rate is basically capturing the male gay population. That's not true for the one I call gay pop, the census population one. That's going to capture women as much as it captures men. On the other hand, the gay pop one is going to capture older people, more established people in more established unions, whereas CAR 92 might be capturing people who are younger and more sexually active. So what we do is we do a categorical analysis. We divide independently, according to each measure, states into high, mediums, and lows groups. And I'm just going to show you, according to both measures, how the response to that question that we went over, do you approve of same-sex relationships, how that evolved over time. The green is the low exposure states in both cases. The pink is the high exposure states. You can see that they're kind of following parallel trends in the 70s. Here in the 80s, high AIDS states, you can see a decrease in approval. It's not a very positive thing, AIDS. You don't see that with so much in the second measure because it's not being driven primarily by AIDS. And what I'm going to argue is that once you look at the controls and everything, the difference in the jump, how much everybody jumped up, both low exposure states and high exposure states. But the jump is much greater in high exposure states than it is in low exposure states. So let me show you what we do. We do a diff and diff analysis where therefore we have state fixed effects, fixed effect. We have a bunch of individual characteristics that are each of them interacted with a decade dummy. So it's the way that these characteristics matter to the response, do you approve of same-sex relationships, is allowed to differ in the 70s from the 80s from the 90s. And then we have our main coefficient of interest, which is this gamma, which is telling you how individuals, given their characteristics, react when they come from a high versus medium versus low exposure state in the 70s versus the 80s versus the 90s. The vector of individual characteristics are age, gender, race, a whole bunch of residential categories, because maybe people in cities act very differently, say, than people in the open country. Education categories, household real income, and household real income categories. So let me just show you this one in a little bit of detail, and then I'll move on. Our dependent variable is, again, do you approve of same-sex relationships? And people who answer yes get a 1, and those who answer no, I've already told you how we're coding those, get a 0. And the first thing I want you to understand is, as we move from left to right, all I'm doing is, there's always state in your fixed effects, but I'm adding more controls. Okay, this last one, column 4, is using a continuous measure of exposure rather than the categorical variable, rather than dividing them into high, medium, and low. And as you can see, if you lived in a high AIDS state in the 90s, when you answer in the 90s, you're about 5.5 percentage points more likely to approve of same-sex relationships, given all your individual characteristics, relative to the same type of person living in a low AIDS state in the 90s, relative to the gap that already existed. Remember, there's a gap that exists between these two types of states. It's not small, and that gap gets larger in the 90s by 5.5 percentage points. A few other just interesting things to point out, because they're worth thinking about why they happen. I don't have a good answer, by the way. One is women. Women start out the same as men. In the 80s, they are about 3.5 percentage points more favorable than men. In the 90s, that difference between men and women grows to 6 percentage points, relative, again, to the 70s. Sorry, not relative to 90, it goes by 6 percentage points. Another interesting is a racial aspect. Black people are start out already 6 percentage points less likely to approve of same-sex relationship than white people. And that grows to 9.5 percentage points in the 90s. So we see that racial gap exist. If we were to, that was measuring exposure with the AIDS variable. If we measure it with the census variable, the gay pop, basically very similar conclusions. Instead of being 5.5 percentage points, it's about more like 7 to 8 percentage points. Women are more positive. It already starts in the 80s. Black people are more negative. It already starts in the 70s. So very, very similar conclusions hold. And we can do robustness for this. We can ask, if we put something that's exogenous, at least to any change in attitudes you might have had, which is the religion that you were raised with, the coefficients don't budge very much. The coefficient in purple that I'm graphing here is that on the AIDS variable in high AIDS states in the 90s. The coefficient in pink is in high gay population states in the 90s. So I'm graphing those coefficients, those are the dots, and then the 95% confidence interval around them. We can use a different way of thinking about approve. We can say, we're gonna say you approve of same-sex relationships as long as you don't tell us that it's always wrong. As you can see, that gives you very similar results. We can do something fairly heroic, which is to introduce at the state level a linear time trend. And when we do that, things become much noisier, but otherwise don't change very much. We can exclude 2002, which you might not have seen. It becomes quite a bit more positive. Things don't change. We can exclude the highest exposure states and the lowest exposure states, and that doesn't change. We can measure the cumulative AIDS rate in 1989 rather than 1992, and that doesn't change things. We can divide things into terciles rather than using kind of a little bit more where the data jumps types of measure, and that doesn't change. We can divide into median, above and below median states, according to both measures, and that gives you very similar results. And lastly, and importantly for this, we can control for something that is endogenous, which is to ask to use people's answers to what political party they identify with, and it could be Republican, Democrat, or independent. And once we control for people's political parties that they identify with, that still doesn't change things, even though the parties took opposite positions on this. And in fact, it's very interesting. In a follow-up paper, what we show, or we explore, this is just Sahar and myself, what we do is we explore when did this political difference, when did it ever occur? You know, when did this gap really appear between Republicans and Democrats? And we show that the jump between Republicans and Democrats is not the 1992 election, but rather it occurred in the mid to late 80s. Lastly, we can ask, well, does this really matter for anything? And it's hard to ask that question because you have to ask yourself, you know, what do you want to measure? So one thing that we can measure are suicide rates. And what we can do is to look at suicide rates across the 50 states of the US in the pre-period and in the post-period. So this is before the election, 1989 through 1991. I'm taking the suicide rate for a particular age group, those between the ages of 15 to 34. And within that 15 to 34, there's actually 3 age groups, and they're all, they're not simply added together, they're all made representative of the national level. So each group is getting the same type of weighting across all states. So this would be the pre-average, and this would be the post-average. On the x-axis, you have the log of our 2 measures. Here on the right, you have the cumulative AIDS rate in 92. Here you have this gay population measure in the 1990 census. And what you can see is if you look at the difference between suicide rates in a state post relative to pre, that difference tends to be more negative. That is, post has gone down relative to pre. The greater is the exposure to the gay community. And the reason that we think that that happens then is because a lot of these suicides, we don't have proof. In the psychology literature, it's thought that these suicides occur a lot because of the stigma associated with either being gay and it being known or having to hide one's sexuality. Okay, we have 10 minutes, including questions. Okay, so first, I'm going to conclude. So what do I want to say? I'm going to say that what happened in the US, and I didn't give you that much historical context, and my apologies, but there's a time constraint. What happened in the US is that the AIDS epidemic unified a group, which is gay people, that before had very dispersed political leanings. You could be a gay Republican, you could be a gay Democrat. Why? Because if you're rich and you want, low taxes, you went for the Republicans. If you cared more about, I don't know, the social safety net, you may have been a Democrat. Now comes one issue that is so much more important than everything else, which is to find a cure for AIDS. The gay community completely mobilizes behind this issue in ways that I do not have time to really explain. They decide to target the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party responds. So we argue that what the AIDS epidemic did was to provide a shock, which eventually led to the mainstreaming of gay issues in the US political debate and much larger media coverage. We think that this led people to rethink their attitude towards same-sex relationships and put in motion a process of cultural change. And what we actually show, this is what we think, but what we actually show is that the greater is the exposure to the gay community, the larger is the change in public opinion. This is in line with contact theory. It's also simply in line with it being more salient. Those places would have had a more visible gay community. You would have had more people coming out, so more people being aware that they know someone who is gay, and much more local mobilization and more local media coverage. The last two things I want to say, two slides that I want to say about what conclusions we can draw from this. Should one conclude that a negative shock for a marginalized group is going to lead towards positive cultural change towards this group? And here, both the AIDS epidemic, its timing, and the nature of the issue have special features. First of all, had science been less advanced, or had the US held a less liberal view of civil rights, the AIDS epidemic could have led, as it did in some countries, to the quarantine of those with the disease and to the persecution of gay men. Furthermore, one thing that the AIDS epidemic did, which other issues may not do, is to make it clear that attraction towards same-sex individuals transcends class divisions and racial distinctions. If you combine this with a democratic process that incentivizes politicians to want money and to want votes as much as possible, then there's much greater possibility of seeing this group as being politically attractive, courting this group, and responding to its concerns. Lastly, from the perspective of a potential parent or a potential parent who may or may one day have a gay child, there's large gains from a society from having more accepting attitudes towards same-sex relationships. This is kind of a win-win situation. This is far less likely to be true if we think about other discriminated racial or ethnic groups, or even women. You're competing with them for jobs, you're competing with them for housing, you're competing with them for positions in colleges, etc. So it's going to be far less true for other groups, or even for groups of immigrants. Nonetheless, what we think our paper shows is that there can be a general interplay between shocks, institutions, both the media and the democratic process with competing political parties, and then culture changing. And so with that, I want to say muchas gracias. Thanks for having me. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have time to ask.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raquel. Actually, we have a couple of questions here. The first one that they said is that did changes in cultural views on female labor force participation and same-sex marriage affect beliefs in other cultural aspects of society? I mean, we noticed something on your results, but would you like to emphasize?
So can you just rephrase that question, or just repeat it one more time?
Sure. Is changes in cultural views on female labor force participation and same-sex marriage affects the beliefs in other cultural aspects of society?
I mean, they tend to go hand in hand, and also I think that's why they're resisted. I mean, if you ask yourself, why did people think, gay sex was so bad? I mean, really, 20% only approved of it. Everybody else thought it was bad. Why do people think it was so bad? I think part of it is because it challenged an idea of what it means to be a man. I think women felt that less, and I don't think it challenged that much the idea of what it meant to be a woman. But if being a man, being not caring about certain clothes, or not wearing the color pink, or, not doing certain jobs, that kind of change, that was being challenged. So I think it challenged and kind of an ideal of what masculinity means, but that's not just an isolated cultural ideal. It's also who has power in the household, for example. Female labor force participation, I mean, it challenges the idea, again, of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. The model for most societies was men as the breadwinner, that is, earning the money, and women as the warm person who takes care of the children, the nurturing one. And I think there's still a lot of resistance, and that's why women get called all sorts of words that I'm not going to say out loud now, when they're, aggressive or when they challenge views. And in fact, women very often, when they get ahead, often find that what they do to get ahead is to tone down their tone, be nice, smile, not be labeled an angry woman. This is something that, like Hillary Clinton used to say. So yeah, no, I think it challenged a lot of things, and I'm sure other things changed as well in the cultural domain. But what didn't change, what was remarkably, not changing alongside with it, were attitudes, say, towards abortion. That did not change. Not that, at least the way that question is asked. You kind of see it staying the same. Gun laws, not very much. Pornography, we don't see any discontinuity. So there's a lot of things that remained kind of stable, or that didn't change in the same time period. So yes, attitudes towards, for example, civil rights of gay individuals changed. Attitudes about whether you can discriminate against women in the workforce changed. That is still an ongoing process. But it's harder to point a little bit, I think, to what the causes and what's the effect. Did one thing change all of them, or did these things change and therefore those attitudes change? So I don't know if I did a good job answering your question, but that's the best I can do at short notice.
Great. Actually, I'll take advantage that I'm kind of the host here, and I'm gonna give you one of my questions is that actually you show a lot that because of newspapers and TV and all these programs are a great source of data, but now we have the social networks, and that has a different dynamic. So I was wondering, to what extent could you expect that, for example, a reversal, for example, on gay acceptance, given that you can, the rise of fake news, or even, the propagation of far-right groups, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. If you look at corporate America is in favor of gay rights. Corporate America is in favor of ending discrimination against Black people. I think from a capitalist point of view, there's strong forces that say we need to make use of whatever talent we have, and we need to have the consumers we have. Today, if you were a company that spoke out against gay individuals, Twitter would, be on fire. If you made a racist comment, as a CEO or as a manager, you're out, and you say it publicly, you're out of a job. So there is much more of corporate America and government, which are on the side of the, let's say, more progressive beliefs. So yes, there are these hate groups, but it's not clear. I don't know that to what extent they try to work against women or against gay people as a group. It's more that they work against a woman. They hate Alessandra, or Cortez. They hate her, but they hate her for many reasons. Okay, now they might attack her as a woman, but they hate her for many reasons. I'm sure there are some gay individuals that get a lot of hate mail and a lot of hate things, but I don't, I think that it's bad that we don't have this thing that we all watch, which is TV news, in the sense that we're all getting our news from the same sources. And so therefore there's that more of a check and balance. People, as you're, correctly pointing out, Fabiola, people get their news from really, really stupid places. But I'm not sure that we've seen, because of that in particular, any sort of backlash against gay individuals or against, more feminist ideas per se. I'm not sure.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Raquel. Oh, well, I think we have 1 minute for the last question. And they ask, which cultural change do you envisage in the near future in the US? Do you think which will be relevant to the labor market, for example?
What cultural change will be relevant to the labor market? That's a good question. I'm not very good at prophesizing. I really don't know, because that's very specific. I mean, if you ask me what cultural change is going to happen, and I would have told you the same thing 20 years ago, we're all going to become vegetarians. I have no doubt. I mean, no doubt that in 50 years, everybody's going to be a vegetarian. Both because of moral reasons and because it's not going to be tenable from the maintaining gas production, from the inefficiencies, etc. But that's not, unfortunately, what you're asking me. You're asking me for the labor with ramifications for labor force participation. I think something that's happening already now, I think academia is going to become a less good career to be in. I think we're going to start to be disappearing. I think that, we're going to get gobbled up by industry more and more and more. That's already happening in some fields. Already, if you have students, more students, I mean, always some students went to the private market. Today, you cannot ignore the private market. You cannot ignore Amazon as a potential employer. You cannot ignore Google as a potential employer of economists I'm talking about. Now, more generally, that's not very exciting, but I think academia is going to become, we're going to see technological change in academia, and we're going to see the private sector being a much bigger employer than what it is today. So I think we're going to shrink despite the growing importance of education. So that's not, it's not a very exciting prophecy, but we'll see if it's true or not.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raquel. Thank you for your answers. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I thank you once again for your participation along the conference.
It was really my pleasure. Muchísimas gracias todos y hasta la próxima. Chao. Bye.
Gracias.
Good night, ladies and gentlemen. In the name of the organizers, Sociedad de Economistas de Bolivia, Universidad Privada de Santa Cruz de la Sierra, UPSA, Fundación INESAT, and Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Bolivia, we warmly welcome you to the closing ceremony of the Bolivian Conference on Development Economics 2021. This closing ceremony will be presided by Fabiola Saavedra, co-chair of the BCDE 2021, Sergio Daga, co-chair of the BCDE 2021, and Diego Escobari, chair of the BCDE 2022. To begin, I would like to invite Fabiola Saavedra to share a few words.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to thank to each and every one of the participants that joined us during these 2 days of the conference. We are very grateful to the Universidad Privada de Santa Cruz de la Sierra UPSA, to the INESAT, to the SDSN, and the Academia Boliviana de Ciencias Económicas. We wanted to thank our keynote speakers and the impeccable presenters of all our invited sessions. And well, last but not least, I wanted to especially thank all our standing presenters on each one of the parallel sessions that we had. We wanted to thank you all for your contribution in the dissemination of economic research. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiola. Next, I would like to call upon Sergio Daga to say a few words.
Good night. In the name of the host of the BCDE 2021, Universidad Privada de Santa Cruz de la Sierra UPSA, I would like to thank all the team that made this conference possible. The co-chair, Fabiola Saavedra, the scientific committee, the board members of the Society of Bolivian Economists, and especially, I would like to thank all the team behind scenes, the communication team of our university. These guys have done an amazing job since day one. All the students of our university that voluntarily offer their time and support in all sessions. Also, thank you, Boomerang, our technological partner of the conference. And last but not least, I would like to thank all the keynote speakers, the invited speakers in the special sessions, and all the presenters in the parallel sessions. This virtual conference has been a success because of all of you. Thank you. Even though we are happy to be able to virtually connect with each other during this conference, my personal opinion is that I hope next year's BCDE could be held physically. I think nothing replaces the conference dinner and, of course, the farewell cocktail party where the networks are enhanced. Thank you again for trusting our university to be the host of the most important academic conference in Bolivia. Good night.
Thank you, Sergio. Finally, we invite Diego Escobari to close the BCDE 2021 and make the invitation to the BCDE 2022.
Thank you. So on behalf of the conference organizers, so we have CEBOL, we have UPSA, ABCE, INESAD, SDSN, Boomerang. We thank you all for your participation. We had a great, amazing conference. We had a variety of topics, a variety of tools, nationalities, affiliation of authors. So we have close to 100 submissions. We have 4 amazing and very engaging keynote addresses, including our last presenter, Raquel Fernández. We had 23 contributed sessions on a variety of areas. We also had 7 special sessions. We had 66 papers we discussed, and so that's something new for this version of the conference. And we have presenters from 23 different countries. So no special order, but we have presenters from Japan, South Africa, the UK, Bolivia, Denmark, Pakistan, Chile, France, Germany, Netherlands, Colombia, Italy, Canada, Spain, Peru, India, Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, China, and Switzerland, and the US. I stopped counting, but there were over 10 different states. So we had, within Bolivia, we had 9 different affiliations. So we had, of course, presenters from Universidad Privada Santa Cruz de la Sierra. We had presenters from Universidad Privada Boliviana, Universidad Mayor de San Simón, INESAD, Chamber of Industry, so that's CAINCO, Universidad Católica Boliviana, Universidad Mayor de San Andrés, even delegation of the European Union in Bolivia, and Universidad San Francisco Javier de Chuquisaca. We also had 16 presenters, so that's about 24% of the presenters were females. We would like to have more, and luckily we have Bowen, so that's an amazing initiative, and we're pretty sure that it's going to go up in the next few years. And working with this group is fantastic. This is like a dream team. Everybody's volunteer. We all share the same passion to promote economic development, encourage academic discussion, and we want to improve the standards of living, not only for Bolivia, but around the world. And we're all volunteers that work tirelessly, reviewing papers behind the scenes. And as Sergio was saying, there's a lot of work from UPSA. So thank you all for all your work, for all the details behind the scenes. I think it was perfect. And then, of course, we want to encourage young Bolivian researchers to join CEBOL. This is a fantastic group to work with. And then for 2022, as Sergio said, we would like to have this in person, right? So it's hopefully we're going to be able to meet each other, let's say, greet each other in person. We still don't know where, but we're looking forward to meeting everybody again next year. And we're going to be making the announcement of the location in the next few months. But thank you all for your participation. And yeah, cheers, and hope to see you soon. And thank you again, everybody, for your work and help and pushing econ to help development.
Thank you, Diego. With this, we close the BCDE 2021, not without thanking all of you who contributed to the success of this event. Good night.